Okay, this one's going to be fairly quick and dirty, but there's a lot of editing involved, and I wanted to get it out as quickly as I can. But this is all about the discussion we've been having on Thunderf00t's video about Stefan Molyneux, and he makes a lot of claims based on clips he plays, and it's primarily from one of Stefan's appearances on the Joe Rogan show, so I'm going to focus on that one. So let's take a quick look at the clips that Thunderf00t uses and the claims he makes based on them. And, I mean, this is one of those little red flags that should come up. If you see someone just playing the same clip over and over again, it's the same little clip, and they don't give you any of the context, they don't play anything before or anything after, makes you kind of wonder if they've got the time to play the clip over and over and over again, why don't they play a little more of it and give you the context? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at Thunderf00t's claims, and I'm going to see what clips from the Joe Rogan Experience that Thunderf00t played, and then I'm going to play the larger clip from that same segment of that same episode. So let's take a look.
This practice of defooing, it's pretty widely criticized, right? I mean, your wife got in trouble for this, for advocating this on your show, right?
No.
She didn't?
No.
Didn't she get suspended? Didn't she have...
No, none of that is true. She was never suspended. Her practice continued. They had some questions about the podcast, and in the end of it, they said, listen, we thought that maybe you had been given advice without giving a full psychological question or workup.
This practice of defooing, it's pretty widely criticized, right? I mean, your wife got in trouble for this, for advocating this on your show, right?
No.
She didn't?
No.
Didn't she get suspended? Didn't she have...
No, none of that is true.
So that's just lies. It's online.
Yeah, none of it is true. She was never suspended. Her practice continued. They had some questions about the podcast, and in the end of it, they said, listen, we thought that maybe you had been given advice without giving a full psychological question or workup.
The quote that I had written down was that she had been told her statements were... in support of defooing are not supported by current professional or consistent with...
That was in the complaint. The final result was that defooing is perfectly consistent with best psychological practices.
So this was just in the complaint. So people are taking this out of context.
Can you believe it? Something
Crazy.
On the internet is being taken out of context.
Well, that's very illuminating then. That makes people feel a lot better. Because that is the one thing that people consistently have issue with a lot of the teachings of you and your FDR.
Well, let's look at it this way, right? So in the 60s, I'm sorry to interrupt, but in the 60s, there was, I mean, it's great. I appreciate you bringing all this stuff up. I mean,
I
generally don't address it
because it's interesting stuff.
So in the 1960s, feminists, and I think really great feminists, came along and said to women, don't put up with abuse, right? I had this woman on my show. She's Erin Pidsey. She created the first women's shelter in England. And women would come beaten up and broken down to her shelter. And everybody was appalled, absolutely appalled. Until death do us part was the mantra, right? That you can't leave your husband no matter how abusive, no matter how terrible, no matter how drunken, no matter how whatever, right? And she basically said, well, I don't think that's right. I think that you should not stay in abusive relationships. Now, if the only people you ever talked to were the husbands, the abusive husbands that these women had left, what would they say about this woman?
Yeah. No, I see your point.
It's not the children.
Right.
It's not the adult children who are complaining about this. It's the parents. I mean, what would you expect? I mean, if you promote voluntarism in relationships and then people go to a therapist and, like I was, I don't know, 2000 and whatever it was, years and years ago, there was some write-up in the newspapers about some guy who left his family. A therapist was helping him through the whole process, and the therapist was recommending it, and the therapist was the one who was helping him through the process. But somehow it's the podcast in Canada that is the sole cause of all this stuff.
But I think that when people hear that, this idea of cutting people off, defooing, as you call it, cutting people off, it makes them nervous.
Why?
Because that's
why?
I mean, it's principal directive of cults.
It's not. It's not.
That's not a principal directive of cults
because
to cut
otherwise,
people out of your life?
No.
Isn't it though?
No, listen.
Isn't
Do
that
you think,
though?
let me ask you this, Joe. Do you think that a woman who's being abused by her husband should stay or leave?
No, stay.
She should stay.
No, of course not.
Of course not.
No, she should leave.
Right.
Yes, of
Okay.
course. Yes.
So why is it any different between adult children and their parents?
No, you're right. If your parents abuse you, I absolutely 100% wholeheartedly agree. If you have
And-
abusive asshole parents, you should cut them off.
And furthermore, I strongly suggest, and I've been to therapy myself, and I think it's a wonderful discipline if you get a great therapist. I have consistently said, if you have problems with your parents, sit down with them and talk about them. Screw the philosophy. Screw this, all this other stuff we've been talking about, the state and so on, right? If you have issues with your parents, like if they beat you up or if they never paid any attention to you, sit down and talk with them and air your grievances. Because you have to be honest in relationships if you're going to have a relationship.
I agree.
And have conversations with them and talk with them. If the abuse escalates, if it gets worse, try and continue to have the conversation until you just can't take it anymore. If you're considering family separation, talk to a therapist. And don't do it without a therapist. It's been my consistent mantra for 8 years. Go talk to a therapist and make sure a therapist reviews the whole situation with you, goes with you through the whole process. Now, that's a heck of a lot more than women who are being abused by their husbands usually get in terms of advice, right? Mm-hmm. But as far as I know it, the people who have left their families have done so under the care of a therapist, which, I think is really essential and important because it is a challenging thing to do.
The even crazier thing is, by Stefan's reasoning, he does want you shot. He wants to shoot you himself.
Now, someone comes to take a kidney, sure. Someone invades your home, sure. Somebody steals your car, maybe shoot to wound, not to kill, but...
Nobody wants to go in these particular directions. It's just principles, right? You have to sort of hang on to your principles no matter what, right? So if you're into the non-initiation of force, right, that self-defense, perfectly morally legitimate, but you can't go around popping people in the head without provocation. You can't go around stealing people's stuff. So the non-initiation of force. And if you accept that as a principle, and if you try to get philosophy as close to like the physical sciences, they don't have exceptions. They say, well, this rock will fall this fast in Kazakhstan and this fast in Philadelphia. I mean, this is universal, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're going to go with the non-aggression principle, then the concept of government is morally illegitimate because the government is that group of people in a geographical area that initiate the use of force against others. And some people agree with it and some people don't, but those who don't do end up being on the receiving end of force that they don't agree with.
So, for instance, when someone asks him if paying taxes is actually supporting what he views as an immoral structure of the state.
I mean, if you're paying taxes, you're supporting the state. If you're following the laws, you're essentially supporting the state. You're following laws that you don't agree with.
Right.
Like when someone says, I don't support the state, what the fuck does that even mean?
But, come on, Joe. I mean, someone who's in a concentration camp is not supporting the regime, even if they're not fighting it. But at some point, if you are committed to a moral goal, then people who are happy or comfortable or positive or pro the initiation of force against you in pursuit of that moral goal, I think that I cannot have people in my life who are going to, after I have explained it and after they have agreed with the general principles, as I said in the clip that you just played, I can't have those people in my life. I can't have people in my life who want me thrown in jail for following my conscience. Somebody was talking about Holocaust is not a big deal, or who cares, right? Uh-huh. And this is an extreme example, and obviously it's contentious. But at some point, if somebody was a Holocaust denier, and I would at some point have to say, look, I mean, this is really not acceptable. I mean, we can't, right? Or I can say, well, I'm not, for reality or truth or Judaism or anything like that anymore. That is the reality of having a committed moral principle. If you are in the 18th century and you are for the end of slavery and everyone around you is like, I think slavery is a necessary and moral institution, and you've had years of conversation with them about the moral reality, and you've shown them the pictures. In the 20th century alone, Joe, governments murdered 250 million human beings, not including war. 250 million human beings, 250 million human beings were murdered by governments in the 20th century. That is some serious shit that goes down. That is like, I don't even know how many Holocausts, right? Mm-hmm. And so people who support the state, and I'm talking about after years of conversation, right? Because it takes a long time to change these paradigms. But at some point, if you are committed to a moral goal, then people who are happy or comfortable or positive or pro the initiation of force against you in pursuit of that moral goal, I think that I cannot have people in my life who are going to, after I have explained it and after they have agreed with the general principles, as I said in the clip that you just played, I can't have those people in my life. I can't have people in my life who want me thrown in jail for following my conscience.
Not only that, but Steph makes sure that he doesn't break off this relationship with the people who want him dead. Further, he goes out of his way to buy the ammunition for the people who want him shot.
I pay my taxes. I obey all the laws.
Right.
I really can't, myself, I can't get past this idea that if I have people in my life who say, Steph, if you disagree with me about the welfare state, I think the welfare state is a complete disaster and incredibly destructive to the poor, then you must pay the taxes for the welfare state, or I support you being thrown in jail. Or if people are pro the war in Iraq, or say, I mean, I'm Canadian, but let's say I was in America, and if people say to me, Steph, I think you should be thrown in jail for not supporting the war in Iraq. Well, that would be a pretty aggressive action for somebody to sort of eyeball you and say, yes, people should come and throw you in jail, where god-awful things are going to happen to you. That, to me, is a very aggressive and very real thing. But if you are committed to something, like let's say you're against racism, which is, of course, a wonderful thing to be against, at some point, if you got friends in the KKK, you got to make a choice. Mm-hmm. You have to make a choice. If you say, well, I really want the friends in the KKK, then fine. Then you're just not that much of an anti-racist.
Right.
I get it, right? But if you say, well, I want to be a committed anti-racist and I want to maintain my friendships in the KKK, that's kind of a problem, right? So so I say, look, if you want to hang around with a bunch of people who want you thrown in jail for following your conscience, do it. That's completely fine. But don't say that you're committed to the belief system then, right? If you are committed to the belief system, this is going to be a collision at some point. I mean, that's not something I'm making up. That seems to me to be pretty true. But that's sort of where people, I think, get upset.
But if you're saying that you're going to cut people out of your life that support the state, to what extent do you have to not support the state? I mean, if you're paying taxes, you're supporting the state. If you're following the laws, you're essentially supporting the state. You're following laws that you don't agree with.
Right.
Like when someone says, I don't support the state, what the fuck does that even mean?
But, I mean, come on, Joe. I mean, someone who's in a concentration camp is not supporting the regime, even if they're not fighting it.
So are we all in a concentration camp?
No.
About our business I'm just paying the taxes.
I'm analogizing that obedience to force is not supportive of force, right? I pay my taxes. I obey all the laws.
Right, but then the dissent of that obedience, right. the disallowing of the state, or the disapproving, rather, of the state. Like to what extent do you require to maintain a friendship?
All I require for friendships with me, all I require is for somebody to say, I do not support the use of force against you for peaceful activities. That's all I require. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to join a march. They don't have to chain themselves to an IRS officer or anything like that. All I require is for people to say, I do not want you shot for following your conscience. I reject the use of force against you for peaceful activities. That's it. That's the magic key to the kingdom of me.
Well, that's all very, very reasonable. And in saying that, but also saying that you also are following the laws, you're still sort of supporting the state, aren't you?
Yeah, again, we're back to this question of support. I don't think that enforced compliance could be
considered support.
Otherwise, rape, there's no such thing as rape, because if the woman's not fighting back, right, obviously it's, a terrible situation. So, no, all I require is for people to say it is coercion, and I think it's wrong. That's all. I mean, nobody has to do anything, because I think that once everybody gets that, then evil is a very tough thing to fight. Because most people, like once someone identifies something as evil, it's usually done. Like once immorality is clear to people, it's usually over and done with. Like that's why nobody says, let's bring back slavery, because everybody recognizes what a social immorality it is. So it has no power, which had huge power throughout most of history. Slavery now has no power. Or let's say, let's take away the rights of women. Now, nobody suggests that, because it would be wrong. But it's from a lot of history, that was how a lot of societies functioned. So once people see immorality for what it is, it loses all of its power and society fundamentally changes. That's why all I want is for people to see what I call the gun in the room. That when people are talking about the state, they are at the bottom talking about the use of violence and the initiation of violence.